Hi everyone, welcome to the Quest podcast. Today my guest is Sarah Poet, and we'll be talking about reclaiming the feminine and the masculine in each of us. Hope you enjoy it. Life is a quest for logic and reason. It is a quest to find balance between science and faith. Life is a quest for knowledge and understanding. But most importantly, it's a quest for personal discovery. Whatever your quest, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Welcome to Quest. Hi everyone, I'm your host, Todd Fischer, and welcome to Season 3 of Quest. A quest is a search for something. And this podcast will show you how we know what we know through interviews with people that have incredible stories of dedication and perseverance. To me, curiosity is part of what makes us human, and there's still so much we don't know. There's joy in discovery. It's what drives us. It's our quest. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the Quest podcast.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you as a guest. I watched your TEDx talk, and I loved it. I was fascinated by it. So I was like, I've got to have her on to talk about this.
Oh, great. I'm so glad. I'm glad it made sense. Feel free to ask me anything. Truly, it's like open book. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into talking about the TEDx in just a second, but right now, let's kind of like go back a little bit. Let's tell the listeners a little about your background and your education.
Sure. My background and my education. Well, I have a lot of personal background. I'll answer anything you want, but some of it's like I'm writing a memoir right now, so it's like, "Ooh, that's a big question." The background. So, I grew up. I know that you talk about spirituality a lot, and so I grew up in a really small Methodist church that my father made me go to in southern Pennsylvania, and I rebelled against this. Like I sat there sort of curiously listening for what the directions were, and then intuiting them in my system. But I also was very much overpowered, like I had a really strong inner guidance system, but I didn't know how to honor that. And my father especially was such a presence and a force. And of course I wanted his love. And so I tried to be a good girl, but I ended up actually getting pregnant at 18, and that's not what good girls do. And so that really shaped my life, which I mentioned in the TEDx, because after my child was born, she was placed for adoption. Now, I chose her adoptive family, and so she was placed into a family that I chose for her. And then the recipe for success given to me by the adults that I was looking to for guidance at the time was you have to go make something of yourself. Right. And so I really tried to live by that societal recipe of like what that meant. And my mother worked in education, interestingly. And so I grew up kind of like playing school and playing therapist and really just loving, like playing school with my little sisters and like the stuffed animals and like really wanting to take care of everyone. But when I entered into education, the field of education myself, I always worked in these alternative settings, like holistic, alternative, places where the kids were like kicked out of public school and it was like their last step. And we were trying to do really alternative forms of education with them. And so I navigated that field of education for 15 years, doing some really cool, innovative things, working with teenage boys a lot, kind of always having this inner curiosity about like, how do we raise boys? How do we raise girls? And then I became a mother again in 2009 to my son. He's almost a teenager himself now.
Yeah.
And so parenting this young male became really, really important to me. And then, very long story short, I had an awakening right around that 2012 point, and my son was a toddler, and I it was like I remembered that there was a version of me that I had turned off. And I loved that one. Like, I loved that girl that was a rebel that ended up getting pregnant because she felt good in her body, and loved the man that I was with at the time. And I actually remembered loving him in a way that I hadn't allowed myself to remember, even ever since. And or ever, up until that point, it had been like 10 or more years, since my daughter had been born and adopted. And so I remembered feeling something deeper, and there was an inner call, and this is called Quest. And so I
Yeah.
went on that quest really to remember myself. And that's why a lot of my work and my podcast is called Sacred Remembering, because as I walked that journey, it was just so immense. And I had to do a lot of trauma healing, which I'm actually happy to talk about because it ended up like really being linked to my father in the church. And so on that path, here I was. By this time, I was a school principal. And I was really, wanted to be very nurturing, like I had been when I was a kiddo playing school. And I had worked in special education a lot, and then I was bringing this like deep therapeutic intervention style education into a public charter school. And there was one girl in particular that I really like had this affinity toward, and I really knew that she needed something different. And she really should have been like given a lot more resources. And I was just really advocating for her. And this is the one that I'm mentioning in my TEDx too. And I said, she really needs something different. And I knew exactly what she needed. And they, in this administration meeting, it was like, we can't give those things to her, and you take intuitive leaps. And that was like the criticism, like, you take
Right.
intuitive leaps. And at that point in time, this next leg of my awakening happened, because it was like, here I was, this powerhouse, this principal. I had 2 master's degrees in education by that point. And I was like, but there's this thing called the feminine, and it lives in me. And here I am, like, I was exhausted. I probably had an anxiety disorder. I had trauma showing up in like really maladaptive ways. And I was like just fighting my body, like trying to be a powerhouse. And so, that was even a couple years beyond that moment of like, I left something of myself back there, but then it had infiltrated into my professional life too. And then I went on this giant quest for feminine and masculine reintegration. And that's a whole, that's another journey in and of itself. And so that's been like the last, 8 or so years of my life has really been this quest around feminine and masculine, and how it applies to archetypes, but then it also very, very much became my spiritual path as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, thanks for, creating the space and time for that summary. That was a little bit long, but
No, it's great. I wasn't sure how much of your kind of your biography I wanted to get into, because I knew some of that stuff was like traumatic events in your life for sure. And I was like, maybe I'll spin this a little bit more kind of what you're doing now with your business. But I love that you shared all that, because it's certainly going to come into play in the rest of this interview, I think, as people start to understand you more and what your cause and your mission is.
yeah. And that's really why I say I am an open book, and I've done a lot of trauma healing. I mean, thousands of hours of personal integration work. Right. And so, um, the remembering, like the activation of who I truly am and what I'm here to do on the planet. Of course, I'm still remembering that, but I definitely make it a point to model the storytelling, because I think I have lived this archetypal story that so many women can relate to, of like shutting parts of self down, having to remember parts of self. But yeah, nothing's off limits, because it's all like a part of the journey. So
I
it's
was
not
surprised.
it's not very raw. Like some parts are, but I'll even talk about the raw parts. So no big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was surprised that your topic made it to TEDx, because you know how they are about anything that becomes kind of too new agey or spiritually. It's like, no, not on our stage. So I was like, you're right at that
Well,
cusp.
yeah, and they almost didn't publish it, which I have
Yeah.
on, I have that on my website. And the the topic, I can't remember in this moment what the topic was, but it was like challenging assumptions or something like that, And
Mm.
so I think I can't say for sure, because I didn't know the local team that made the decisions, but I think that maybe one of them had heard of my work locally, and that was sort of how I got in, because through the rehearsals and everything, I couldn't really tell if they were interested or not. And so I was kind of surprised, but also it very much had to do with my spiritual path and my soul journey. And I'll just bring some of that in here. I've always been working on owning my voice, right? Like with the relationship with my father in the church, like being who I am was the quest. And so I was going through a really, really hard year in 2019, after the breakdown of like a very, very significant relationship with a man. And I was going through a dark night of the soul, and I wanted to quit. I wanted to like quit this mission that I had left my career, between 2017 and 2018, left my career as an educator to step onto this path that felt very divinely ordained. Like it was like, Sarah, you are now going to do this, and it's going to be called embodied breath. Like the voice inside was like, or the voice from above was like, here's the name of your business. Here's what you'll be doing. And so I had a little bit of information, but that voice is really clear sometimes in me. And so I knew it wasn't an option to do that. But then through that path, there were so many initiations. It was really hard. And so 2019 was really a rough, like winter into spring, and I was in a dark night of the soul. And a friend of mine reached out and said, TEDx applications are open. I want to hear you tell your story on stage. And when she sent me that message, I actually had this ping, this intuition that I was like, oh shit, I'm going to have to do this. Like I knew that it was actually, spirit or creator or universe, whatever you call it, saying like, Sarah, get your ass back up.
Yeah.
And so that summer, I had a little speaking gig in Pennsylvania, and I went and I did that. And I knew that as soon as I did that, I could feel something shift, because I was like in my native lands, in my homeland in Pennsylvania. And I told an authentic story, like with my feet on the soil, which was really important. And I knew as I walked away, I was like, now I'm going to have to do the TEDx. Like that's the next step. And the email came through for the acceptance that night. So it was
Yeah.
very much like God being like, get on the stage, right? And the choice to say sacred, like sacred feminine, sacred masculine, at that time in my life and in my career was so huge.
Right.
But I was like, I have to. And then there are other TEDx talks on feminine and masculine, but they almost blocked mine.
Right.
So yeah,
I get rejected constantly from TEDx. So I think I'm going to start my own called ToddX. I think
there
will be
you go.
great. I'm just going to
Yep.
make my own
Yeah.
deal. You're
Yeah. I mean, we don't really need it. Like that red dot is recognizable, but
right.
it's also very censored. Yeah.
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 Yeah. So your TEDx was consciously reclaiming the feminine and masculine within each of us.
Yeah.
So for those listeners that aren't familiar with this, like what is the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine?
Right. So, and of course, everyone's invited to watch the talk, where I just try to lay this out really simply, but I'll do so here now as well. We associate feminine and masculine with gender and with societal like definitions or just like prescriptions of gender. Like we kind of have some, oh, I think feminine means I have to sit pretty and masculine means I have to be tough. That kind of like association is normally the first thing that comes up for people. And so
Right.
I'm talking about archetypal energy. And truly, feminine and masculine energy is all that comprises creation. Like every single thing is comprised of feminine and masculine energy. It's literally the architecture that holds the universe together, as far as I'm concerned. And so, down to like energetic specifics, like the architecture of creation itself. And so, feminine, but let's back up to like how this presents in humans. So each of us has feminine and masculine inside of us, and to acknowledge this is actually really, really liberating and really empowering, which is why I'm encouraging everyone to do it who wants to. Um, because we don't have to outsource these things, and we get to be whoever we are and whoever we want to be. So feminine archetypal energy is nurturing, it's intuitive, it is more fluid. It's associated with the water element. It is associated with emotions, and emotions are empowering. Emotions are just energy in expression and, taking form. And then the masculine is, I like to really talk about masculine first and foremost in terms of structure and consciousness. So the masculine, is the ideas we associate it with logic, you know, like if there are all of these opportunities, it's the masculine that's going to like pick a direction and take the action. And so the masculine is actually action oriented.
Right.
But we need to, be in touch with that feminine, which was overridden throughout patriarchal history, for many reasons. But like the intuition was downplayed, the emotions were downplayed, but then we lost, the value, the inherent value of things like nurturing and caregiving, and even how we valued women in a patriarchal society was actually, it went hand in hand with how it was the feminine archetype itself that was like degraded or said was not important. And one of the things that I share in the TEDx is that was what actually gave us a really unhealthy expression of masculine in patriarchal culture, is like this complete suppression of the feminine. Because if you don't have one in a healthy expression, you don't have the other in a healthy expression. And so, this whole thing on the planet right now about like toxic masculinity, and there's a lot of like man shame that's happening, and people are associating masculinity with power over dynamics, or just, this toxic masculine. And that's actually a huge mistake, because and that's part of just the distortion that we're all like supposed to believe, is that, one group has power, the other group doesn't. And
Right.
so as we begin to actually heal our relationship with feminine and masculine, we actually realize that what we're talking about is reunification, like in a spiritual sense. And so if I'm if I'm walking this path of reclaiming feminine and masculine, then ultimately there's going to be a lot of healing in my heart, right? Which is why I can
Sure.
talk about the things that happened in the past, because like on this path, there's the opportunity to say, oh yeah, well, that's what was going on with my idea of what men should have been or what I should have been as a woman. And then when I, relearn the archetypes and kind of bring it home to my heart, it's actually really, really healing.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast was because I feel like, in a way, you've been doing this for a while. So this term doesn't maybe not exist for you, but exists for me. But I consider you like a new thought leader when it comes to
Mm.
something like this, because
Hmm.
it's all too often I see females presenting, programs on the sacred feminine, but there's never a
Hmm.
masculine component of it. I see a lot of
Yeah.
things like that, but
Yeah.
it's odd in this kind of this spiritual new age world. And I think a lot of people are reaching out to that, particularly during COVID. People just wanted answers. They wanted to connect to something. No one really knew what the purpose was anymore. And I feel like a lot of these individuals have kind of sprung up everywhere. And it's particularly on social media. There's a new
Mm.
guru every week on social media, it seems like,
Hmm. Hmm.
and
Yeah.
it's odd because most of the males, which are rare, 9 out of 10 people doing this out there in the interwebs, creating these new movements or whatever programs they might offer, 9 out of 10 are females.
Mm.
And you can almost like shake a stick at how many, the next pretty blonde girl that's doing breath work and yoga and, like, you know
Mm.
what I mean?
Mm.
Like it's always kind of
Mm.
the same thing rehashed. And most of their group is females. And then there's some males out there that are popular, but they never approach anything from a feminine perspective, yet still seem to have a lot of female followers too.
Mm.
In males, it's always hard to reach anyways in this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Males try to stay away
Yeah.
from spirituality. You
Yeah.
don't you don't see them gravitating toward that for whatever reason. I'm not really sure. So I really like your approach of kind of embodying both of these within each of us, because this is something that is important to both males and females. And I feel your reach could be larger than anyone's in that regard. Does that make
Mm.
sense? Everything I was rambling on about there?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And it springs, 20 different thoughts to mind. And so I'm just kind of breathing with that for a moment.
Yeah. But it's an interesting world out there in this perspective. And I think people are more confused at their place in the world more than ever, on personal
Oh
levels,
yeah.
on a
Yeah.
worldwide level. Like, and that's why you have to look deep within you, and you have to discover these things. You have to reclaim these things in you, and you shouldn't be afraid of these things. Feminine, uh, like, oh, I'm not afraid to reach into, what I feel my feminine aspects are. And
Yeah.
and
Right.
I like that. I want to move over to something else that it's kind of orbiting this in a
Mm.
way, I believe. But one of the things that you do in your company is kind of this gender equity and leadership portion of your business.
Mm.
And this is something
Hmm.
you do as kind of a new solution for human resources. And I want to kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
move into that a little bit, because I want to kind of steer into the Me Too movement and the women's liberation movement and some of those things that kind of orbit this, I believe, and
Hmm.
discuss that and talk about, the women and the men's part in this, in a way.
Yeah.
um so I wanted to just kind of talk about this first. So you offer this service as kind of like a new solution for human resources, and I want to talk about what is a typical office scenario that might need this service.
Oh, I love this. And this is actually my newest offering. And so I love that we're talking about this first, because and I'm going to lead into this by addressing something that you just said. So as I was kind of developing this, I was talking to everybody. I was talking to women, I was talking to men, I was talking to couples. It was like, okay, who wants to reunify here? We have all of these wounds of separation between us. Everyone's really on eggshells after Me Too. And so, I was talking to everybody. And for a long time, I really focused on writing to men on social media. I wrote for the Good Men Project. I was lifting up masculinity, and it's very unique. as a woman to be doing that. But that was a part of really what I had to go through too with my father, with this like huge breakup, with a divorce in there. It, but thank God I have a son. Thank God I had loved these male students, right? Because I think I would have been a really angry woman. Like I was an angry woman. Okay.
Yeah.
And then it's like, but Sarah, okay, you can't go on being this angry and raising a kid. Like, what are you going to be mad at men when you're raising a man? Like, you can't do this. And so it was my path to, I don't lead with forgiveness, actually. I don't lead with that because I think that's last. I think that that's really natural when you do your own integration work and your own trauma healing. Like you're working on you and then the rest happens, right? So all that to say, I had to work at this. I didn't start out just like, oh, okay, everybody's unified. Like I really was a woman with a lot of man trauma, a lot of masculine related trauma.
Yeah.
And so when I was on the internet talking, to everyone, the men loved it, loved what I was saying, but they were the last ones to sign up to coach with me. They were the last ones. And so it was like maybe I was ego stroking, whatever, like to them, maybe it just like felt really good that a woman could see it. There was actually a lot of projection too. Like, men were like, oh my God, I want to date you, and I was like, no, I love men, but I'm not your dream partner, I promise. So like there was a lot of mistaken, like, ooh, she gets it. I want to be with her instead of like, ooh, she gets it. She can help me grow.
Right.
and and so that was a lot of learning for me as well. But this to say from a business perspective, as a single mama, it was like I had to pick a lane. And I started working with women. I started my podcast. And so I primarily worked with women and couples. Okay. And so this gender equity piece, quite honestly, arose out of a really terrible situation that happened when my own career ended. Because I worked in a place where I was seeing misogyny and I was experiencing it, but the leadership was actually really well intended and like wanted to be inclusive, but just didn't get it, quite honestly. And so when I resigned and I brought a few things up, there was a very fast movement to offer me a severance and get me out the door. And it was very traumatizing. I think, quite honestly, it was very traumatizing for everyone because I had started this school with very close friends, like a friend of 10 years. And then it was like, get her out of here, just get her out the door. And so here I was, this woman who had really worked for a very long time to own my voice, to heal my trauma, to be a good person, all of these things. And I'd been studying feminine and masculine for a while at that point. And I was like, hey, I want to address some things that I see. And that after Me Too, it was just seen as such a threat. There was actually zero communication, no work to like heal relationships. And it was like no transition necessary, just go. And so I had already started my company, and so I was like, okay, I'm just going to put everything into this. And looking back, I mean, that really stayed with me because those relationships never, like we've still never had a conversation, right?
Yeah.
And the level of trauma probably for the students that I really knew and loved, and because it was a residential program, and I was the only woman actually in the school. I had a staff of all male teachers, and so yeah, like I was the nourishment. I was kind of mama hen as well as like principal and helper and all of those things. I played a role. And so I wanted to approach it differently, but the standard HR practice, it felt like, okay, this woman with her observations is now a liability. Get her out.
Yeah.
And I had to honestly like sign a gag order, as they say. And so I'm speaking around some specifics, but that's my experience of what happened anyway. And so I really did some research when I was developing these offerings for HR. And what I heard, I talked to HR reps and I said, what do you see? What do you need? And there was a lot of, women waking up, especially, after Me Too. What's happening, what I would say is happening is women are realizing, one, we've been oppressed. Two, we have our own stories of silence and being silenced and being treated poorly. And then three, what's happening is that activates a lot of trauma. And we have our own trauma that we're carrying as female creatures. And then we also have like epigenetic trauma that we're carrying from, thousands of years of patriarchy and feminine suppression.
Right.
And so that really sparks a lot in the psyche about like what's fair, what's not fair. And I recently spoke to a business owner that I know personally. And what they were experiencing were they were hiring more women because it was important to him. And he was a male business owner. And what was happening was that, well, quite honestly, in my assessment, there was a lot of trauma that the women were bringing to work. And again, it's really natural. I mean, we are waking up as a planet. And so we have these like open wounds. Like I remember one day, for example, this is what this could look like.
Yeah.
For example, one day I was going to work as this like school principal, and we had a child with like suicidal ideation. And I did not know how to keep him safe. And this triggered this like massive fear and inadequacy. And I'd already lost a child, right? And so maybe it was connected to that or who knows what. But I didn't realize that for like, I was walking around so wound up at work. And somebody said like, well, you're responsible to make sure that he's in eyesight at all times. And I just knew that like my teachers couldn't do that. They couldn't teach and make sure that this child with suicidal ideation was like absolutely safe. And it felt so far beyond my control. And I actually had a total breakdown at work or like driving to work,
Wow.
because it triggered something in my deep psyche about like, I can't keep this child safe. I'm not safe. We're not safe. Right. And I could not do my job that morning. Like I went into the boss's office and just like cried. And I was like, I can't do this. And so that was a mix of the trauma that I was already carrying in my body.
Right.
Right. And I was like showing up at work. So we're all doing this. It's definitely not just unique to women, because I've also interviewed men who, they were having a conversation and then before they knew it, like HR was knocking on their, cubicle saying, you have to take a leave of absence because you've offended so-and-so.
Yeah.
And it's just all this like really non-relational, right? Like all of this, I I think there's often a lot of fear that there's going to be like litigation, or this person is going to cost the company something
Exactly.
by having this concern, where those concerns can actually really empower an organization to learn to listen to people. And of course, yes, drawing boundaries about what is going to happen at work and what's not going to happen at work, right? Like we can't be solving everyone's trauma at work. But like, how can we have workplaces that are able to hear a concern without going to, this person is a liability, get them out the door?
Yeah.
And so that's where I come in, where I can hold a mediation, I can do training for the whole staff, or just for the leadership team in varied dynamics of leadership, like what is feminine leadership, what is masculine leadership, how to be more inclusive with everyone, and how to deal with some of those deep psyche things that come up, especially after Me Too, and especially with men, where like they've been holding these positions of, yes, hierarchical power, right? Positional power. And now it's like, what am I supposed to do to make everybody happy? How do I have to behave? And so I'm actually like really good at being called in to be the like executive leadership coach for male executives who need some coaching, like need to be able to ask these questions. Like, what does she want? Can somebody interpret for me?
Yeah.
Like what this woman is going through, what she needs, what she wants. And so it's not just this like old school way of like just cutting it off, and that causes more trauma,
Yeah.
right?
And
In
you're absolutely
everyone.
right that, we have a litigious society as well as people being highly sensitive now, which is like a
Yeah.
lethal combination of how
Right.
you deal with it.
Right. And HR, like human, relations, it's interesting because it's not um, really equipped, I think, in most cases, to have these new and innovative and necessary conversations. And so, yeah, I'm available for like HR teams or HR reps who are called in when there is this kind of problem or arising. And I look at things very, very differently. And so it's very possible that I can help to solve the relational component, maybe doing some coaching with party A, party B, and then like things can heal. And I think employee retention can happen. Human relationships just like the company gets stronger, whereas that cut and run approach, I think, really hurts companies. And I know turnover costs a whole lot. So that's what that's about.
Right.
Yeah.
So, this is something that's kind of evolved uh, because of the Me Too movement in a way. But before
Yeah.
the Me Too movement, a lot of people, especially young people today, probably don't really remember this or recall this, or maybe even didn't learn about this in school, but there was the women's liberation movement that
Mm,
was huge in the 70s. And it actually started in the late 60s. It ended in the early 80s. It was at its strongest in the 70s. And it really was more of a political movement than anything. And it was all about kind of institutional sexism.
mm,
And it was successful in that way. And it did touch on some things like sexual harassment. Although there was no term sexual harassment then, they did address those types of workplace issues. And they did get a lot of things changed in terms of, women getting better jobs and being in more important positions. And it was the beginning of a much larger movement. And today we have the Me Too movement, which is really more of a social movement against sexual abuse and sexual harassment. But I'm curious, with movements like this, do they lose momentum? Do you think you consider the Me Too movement as successful? Is it still ongoing?
Mm.
Do you feel it will lose momentum, or is this here to stay? What do you think will happen with this?
Oh, wow. Thanks for that question. Um, yeah, so I want to say, like, I don't identify with a movement, right? I think I want to clarify that. What I see happening on the planet is a consciousness evolution.
Interesting. Yeah.
And, in a very broad sense, I see this consciousness evolution being one that's we're moving from separation consciousness that the earth has been operating in for like 10,000 years. And then we're moving toward unity consciousness. And so that's a really big umbrella, right? But over the consciousness evolution, which involves the spiritual awakenings, this is where feminine and masculine are bound to reunify, and so I
Right.
can talk about it in a really non-spiritual way in an HR building, right? Or I can step into these like sacred feminine circles, or the conscious sacred consciousness couples relating work that I do privately with couples, and like really talk about the spiritual aspects of it. So I am dynamic in that way. So I appreciate the question, because it also ties to like the decision to say sacred on the TEDx stage. It's like the decision to have a podcast called Sacred Remembering. It's like we can do all of these things together. We don't have to separate work from our awakenings, work from our wellness. This integration is really such an opportunity on the planet at this
Yeah.
time. And so to get back to your question about like the women's movement and then the Me Too, I think that these are, I would describe them as necessary for the consciousness evolution. I would also describe them as somewhat inevitable in the collective consciousness, like as their collective consciousness awakenings and then planetary awakenings, because these energies also exist in the planet and around the planet. And that gets really, really interesting. And so the feminine and masculine reunification is actually happening in the planet as well. And so we're going to see, I think these things are effects of the natural move toward unity and more people choosing unity and choosing love, and helping to like anchor these things on the planet. But the women's movements will continue to evolve. And I actually have on my website this modern women's pathway, like a typical 10 phases of modern women's awakening, and what's going on with feminine and masculine inside of her, and in her relationships as she's going through these phases of awakening. And so as my path illustrates, the modern woman who's awakening now, who is aligned to a love frequency, to a unity frequency, because that's what our hearts want. We don't want to experience more separation. We don't want to experience more oppression, more fighting, more trauma. We don't want that. What we crave is love and connection as humans. And so there is a very, there's been an exciting sacred feminine awakening movement happening on the planet. And what's happening now, Todd, is women are remembering, I don't want to fight the masculine anymore.
Yeah.
And I want to, embody the love. And if it's okay, I'll share a concrete example from a client that I had this morning,
Sure.
actually.
Yeah.
Cool. That kind of brings it home a little bit. So this beautiful woman recently left the Mormon church, like very, in my opinion, a patriarchal situation, right? Where men are expected to be one way, women are expected to be another way, and women are definitely expected to follow directions. And so
Right.
here's this woman being very radical in her church, in her hometown, and she says, the feminine doesn't have a place here, and I'm not okay with that, and I'm leaving the church. And the whole town's in an uproar. Literally, the whole town's in an uproar. And she's got the pastor like banging down her door, and this was a couple months ago. And now what's happening is she's attracted some attention, and the women are like, I want a little bit of what you've got. Okay. And so they're coming to her. And then the men, the husbands, and the church employees, they are very nervous. They are very nervous about her, and like, what is this woman who's regaining her voice and regaining her sense of self? What in the world could she possibly do? Right. And so, similarly to that boss that I was referring to, it's like, oh my gosh, if the women are speaking up, what's going to happen? Okay. And so, what I heard her say this morning, she was, yes, she wanted to hold space for the women, but no part of her message was anti-man. And what she said was, I want the men to know that they're safe too. And I want them to know that they're loved and that they're appreciated. And I want them to know that we see that they've always done the best that they knew for the women in their lives. And I just thought that that was so beautiful.
Yeah.
And such a gorgeous example of this, deeply feminine heart, that like the women's movements of the 70s and 80s had to fight. And I am not interested in fighting anymore. I don't have energy to fight, right? But
Yeah.
I have energy to like fight for love, but that looks different than like fighting against oppression. And so the more we're integrating and know who we are, the less defensive energy we actually need to have.
Sure.
And so I see many women actually leading in that way. I mean, many women in my circles, right? Leading and saying, I don't want more separation from men. It's like the very independent woman who's like, I don't need a man. Where are all the good men at? Who's the man showing up for me? And then like, they're actually like, okay, wait, I'm a little lonely. I've been pushing away all the men,
Yeah.
And so I think that women are kind of like, oh yeah, no, all that fighting doesn't actually bring love. So
I have a couple quick, business type questions for you.
sure.
Should there be equal pay among women, like men and women for the same job automatically, or should it be based on something else like experience or education?
Should there be equal pay? Should questions make me nervous. Okay, equal pay for the exact same position, exact same education level, exact same experience?
No, for the same job, or should it be based on something like experience or education?
Yeah, I don't think that there should necessarily be equal pay for the position. No.
I was just curious how you
Yeah.
think. With programs like affirmative action, do you believe that was a successful program? Should it be implemented on a larger scale? I think some people worry that like forced methods of putting a minority, a particular race, a particular gender in a job because we don't have someone working in that way, that some people feel that type of forced method breeds resentment. Do you feel those are necessary policies, or is it just for whatever company and whoever applies?
Yeah, honestly, Todd, I don't feel that it's my place to speak on that.
Yeah,
Honestly.
sure. No, I was just curious how
Yeah,
you felt about that.
yeah, I don't have like a real strong opinion
Yeah.
about that. Yeah.
And the reason why I bring it up is because that was one of the big portions of the women's liberation movement, was making sure that women could take supervisor positions of things,
Yeah.
and
Right.
and that's how kind of affirmative action came about. In that, and we've seen this through, the post office and all kinds of other
Yeah.
companies have implemented that, where, if there's not someone Black working, there's not a woman that's working, they have to hire someone to put in those positions. And I'm just curious if that breeds a resentment among other employees, and that makes the rift worse, because we seem to be
Mhm.
more of a divided country more than ever now. Everyone
Yeah.
is categorized and labeled in some way.
Yeah. I can imagine that it would, breed resentment for some, and then for others it would be good. It feels nuanced, for sure. And I do agree with you that, the division, or yeah, like perceived division, is of concern
Yeah.
for sure. Uh-huh.
It's odd. I think a lot of people don't really think about this. I write about this in my book, but we're categorized from essentially our birth, I mean,
Yeah.
before we
Uh-huh.
even realize that we're being put in categories we are, because, we've grown up of whatever race you are, whatever gender you are, all out of your control, right out of the womb. Right. And then,
Mm.
maybe you're in a certain, like you're in a certain income level. Your parents grew up middle class. You grew up poor, or whatever it might be. What kind of community you're in, the kind of car you drive, your political stance. If you were put into a religion, were you baptized Catholic, and that's how you were brought up? Like, so much of this stuff is already kind of programming you as you grow
Yeah.
up, and you don't
Mhm.
realize is that you're now being placed in categories. Everything
Mhm.
becomes categories, which just expands even further the older you get. you know
Mm.
it seems like, and even your age, like, I'm in my
Mhm.
50s, so I'm now, getting in a certain category. Like, I've become useless for certain things in a way,
Mm.
and it's a
Mm.
very odd just how this system works. So I feel like we just have such
Hmm.
everyone wants
Mm.
to be so unique, but that uniqueness has created a tremendous amount of division, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this up, and I kind of go maybe in an unexpected direction with this. So I agree with you that there are a lot of outer categories and a lot of outer boxes, and I would say judgments, right? And a
Yeah.
lot of ways that we learn to play the game. And I think what is happening on the planet right now in terms of a consciousness evolution is that we are all invited to be who we are.
Yeah.
And I think the children are showing us, with all of this non-binary stuff. I have a seventh grader that tells me a lot. And so, it's like the children are showing us that the old categories, they're not going to buy into it anymore.
Yeah.
And it's really beautiful because I mean, in the work that I do with women around standing in the truth of who we are and the sacred remembering, and and I work with men too around finding our voice. But that age, like demographic, is usually like the 35 to 55 that I'm working with. The generation of like, I followed the rules and now I'm remembering to be my authentic self. And what's really cool now, the children are showing us in this consciousness evolution that like they're just coming in. I think they're getting less lost because they are using who they are as their North Star, like more than ever. And I've been, working with children, watching what the children are doing for a long time. And this is what I'm teaching and talking about as well. Like, how can I be who I am and just live in the truth of who I am? And then, Todd, you get to live in the truth of who you are. And then you get to tell me about your experience, right?
Yeah.
And I get to tell you about my experience. And we get to learn to listen to each other, and we get to learn to relate. And listening and relating are very, very different than, somebody's going to assign you a box and somebody's going to assign me a box, and then we have to figure out how to relate while we're in boxes. And I think
Exactly.
that's what manifest that contention that you're referring to is like, where are we getting our information about who we are? Are we getting our information about who we are from, like, the boxes that are being created on the news right now? Are we
Yeah.
getting the information about who we are, by knowing how to sit with ourselves and saying, actually, this is my authentic truth inside of myself right now.
It,
And then
it's
can I
oh,
have that and the next person have their truth, and we're kind to each other.
yeah, yeah. I like where you're going with all that. It's interesting. I think, the who we are thing, right? I think sometimes you think you know who you are based on how you grew up, which may
Yeah.
not have been the best influence. And I feel as children get older, you tend to rebel against your parents. You don't
Yeah.
want to do what they did. Like that's
Yeah. Yeah.
it's kind of interesting because if you go back to like the hippie movement in the 60s, the lifestyle that those people had, their kids wanted no part of it. So there was a
Yeah.
whole
Right.
generation of people that became doctors and attorneys, completely the opposite of what their parents were. And I feel like you see this in every generation, right? So I think what happens is some of these things are really kind of a generational problem and could go away on their own because
Mm,
people grew up seeing their parents function with another race or another gender in a certain way. And that's how they were brought up. And they thought that's how it was done.
yeah.
And that's why I think, like part of Me Too is calling attention to men's bad behavior. That's a fraction of what Me Too is, but it definitely is calling attention to stuff. I definitely thought in my mind about things that, wow, that might have been something very questionable I might have done in the 90s. Like I went back and rethought about things that, like, wow, I didn't realize that maybe I was being disrespectful or that this could be taken a different way. So I certainly learned more about myself when that stuff was put out there. And that's why I
Mhm.
wonder if some of these problems might rectify themselves because now your kids are going to see what their parents did wrong and
Mm,
correct, if that
mm,
makes sense, maybe.
mhm. Yeah, to speak to that, like the recognizing something in yourself. Yeah, thank you for doing that. And what's really cool is when we're talking about feminine and masculine archetypes, and we like really break this down within ourselves, we are all functioning with a dysfunctional masculine
Yeah.
and a dysfunctional feminine, because it was patriarchy, because it was like given to us that way. And so, like, every single man has made mistakes, and every single man does. And I watch my child perpetuate, acts of misogyny, because it's in his DNA, because it's in the culture, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, but we don't have to shame each other for it. We just have to learn.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was one thing that came up. And for, as a woman, I have had dysfunctional masculinity inside of me. And I think that that's really just important, because even someone who is non-binary can still use the language and the tools of feminine and masculine archetypes to talk about, like, I am a spectrum of these things, and there are expressions of the archetype. Like, sometimes I cry and sometimes I really get a lot done. And oh, we can use the words feminine and masculine to talk about that. And so, one story that comes to mind, I was able to learn from a really cool group of kiddos that had, they had diagnoses on the autism spectrum disorder, but they were really high functioning. And they looked at, to your point about the previous generations, they looked at, like, well, what was my mom doing? What was my dad doing? Okay, mom's a woman, dad's a man. And so that, like, became black and white for them. Like, mom, woman, that's women. Dad, man, that's men, right? And so their associations were really clearly based on, like, the affiliation of what they had seen, like, in their experience, which is true for all of us, right? But and then they were like, I don't like what dad did, and so maybe I don't want to be a man.
Mm.
And, so there was a lot of like gender questioning and, maybe I want a sex change and I don't know who I am. And a lot of, teenagers are just trying to find their identity, right? Like that's their
Right.
job. That's their job. And so I think what I was able to do, I was actually teaching at that time, and I taught this integrative unit where we read a book about a trans kiddo, and we looked at statistics and social studies, and we just looked at like data around gender and how people identify and like all the different identifications, and then we looked at history, and then we looked at the archetypes. And that information was really eye-opening for these kiddos. They were like, oh, you mean that I can still be like a man with a penis and identify mostly in a feminine essence? And I was like, yes. Yep. But like when I was sort of mapped out in like a conceptual framework, it was like, oh, that gives me something to explore. Right. And my son was just sharing with me that he had gotten some emails from a classmate who is, questioning gender and just exploring different identities, and they were sending some educational material out to their classmates, like, they're looking for the framework. They're looking for like, where do I fit? And I think these kiddos are creating new frameworks. Obviously
Yeah.
that's true with all of the non-binary stuff going on. And so yeah, they're leading us in a whole new expression of this consciousness evolution.
Do you think that men are scared to interact with women out of fear of something being misconstrued now, or in
Oh
particular,
yeah,
maybe with
I think
like
that's often.
relationships? You can't
Yeah,
flirt with someone or court them like you could before because it could be unwanted, right?
I think that probably happens often. Yeah.
I've noticed that some women are offended by courtesy. Just holding a door open for someone can be taken wrong or come off as an insult. I once tried to pump gas for a woman whose car I was riding in, and she took it as a terrible insult. Like, I can pump my gas myself. And I'm like, hey, I was just being nice. And I was just like, wow,
Mm,
like so many things. Because I grew up doing that anyways.
yeah.
That was part of
Right.
what my parents, be polite, be polite. I hold the door open for a man or a woman on it to be fair, someone's behind me, I hold the door open for them. But
Mm,
but
mhm.
like, I can pump the gas. It's not a big deal. I feel like there's some blowback to this. And I often wonder if apps such as like Tinder are so popular because they remove anything that's questionable and simply it's there for arrangements,
Mm,
like with
mm.
Tinder, it's, a hookup app.
Yeah, it's pretty
So you cut
shallow,
out
I
all the
think.
other
Yeah.
stuff and it's like, okay, where I would have maybe had to go to a bar or work on this and maybe it's unwanted, and I won't, there's no question on an app like that, you know? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't really swim in those waters, like the Tinder and things like that, because in my opinion, I dive in like deeper waters. It feels a little shallow, like
Yeah,
a hookup app kind of thing.
yeah, yeah.
But when you were saying like a woman being offended that you would offer to pump gas or hold a door, I think to when that might have been true for me. And, I can just speak to that. I can't speak to like all women or all men, but for me, there's a little bit of a fear, right? Like, I don't know what else you're going to expect.
Ah, interesting.
Right. And so like women have been you know they're, like taken advantage of a lot, and so there's a lot of self-protection in women, and around hearts in general, but women's bodies have been taken advantage of, women's time has been taken advantage of, and so um we become defensive and armored.
Yeah.
I have black tattoos all over my body. Thank goodness they're at least flowers. But I realized at one point, like, oh, I've been armoring up. Like I looked like a badass. And so it that armoring is very, very normal. And to come through that armoring, a woman has to do a lot of deep self-work. And that's hers to do. And then also, like, one of the things that I teach couples is how to do that together. Like, how does he hold space for that? How does he get to have his own truth about, like, maybe he was molested, maybe he wasn't allowed to use his voice. Men's stuff is more like perpetual people pleasing, like being the nice guy and not like having a backbone. And that can go archetypally kind of that direction, or it can go toward the oppressor, right? Like I didn't ever get my way, and so I'm going to just dominate the hell out of this situation. So all of these behaviors are like learned and adaptive, though maladaptive ultimately, but we take them on because we had to at one point to protect who we are.
There's an interesting dynamic to you. You mentioned your tattoos, and yeah, you look tough, right? And then you've got this beautiful feminine voice, and that's this interesting dynamic. You've got this great duality in a way.
Yeah.
And I think it's brilliant. Everything you've built about yourself. If you've noticed on my podcast, the majority of my guests are females. I love what females bring to the world, and I love to, because I don't get along as well with male guests for whatever reason. And I noticed that a lot of people I bring on in the scientific world are usually against God, for one, which is sort of anti what I'm building here,
Yeah.
And then and when I bring in men that are in some form of religion or spirituality, there is that male hierarchy, or there's a certain level of narcissism to them, and I don't feel like they make compelling, good interviews, and I feel like they're perpetuating the same type of thing that's been going on. I think women are holding the answers right now. So I love it.
Yes.
But I want to say, just from my perspective, my feeling on women, I know I hear a lot of this, to me, a lot of, I'm going to figure out how I want to phrase this exactly so I don't come out saying is it wrong.
I won't hold it against you if it comes out kind of
well,
like, let's model a space where like we can say something and maybe be a little off.
Try to articulate just the exact words I'm going to say. But my feeling on women is, I feel women are like a muse for men. Like they are, like they're like, in the Greek god world, where Zeus created the muses, and the muses would go out and they would encourage people to create poetry and music and writing and things like this. I want to create. Women inspire me to create. I think they're brilliant in that regard. And men have fought wars for women, and males' relationships to their mothers are incredibly important. I feel there's a very deep love for women. I feel that just some of the things that have happened kind of in the work life or treatment, or people that are uneducated, have kind of soured everything. I think women have always been important to men for a very long time. And I think if you think of all the great songs or the great paintings, they're for women. It was men doing this for women. I mean, all the great songs are a woman's name, and it's like, I think that there's this brilliance that women bring to the world that has been more beaten down in the last 100 years. And it could be for a variety of reasons. And it's not for me to go and try to look historically when exactly this happened. But my feeling is, I write my best stuff when I'm writing it for a muse. And it's interesting because I don't think you're lusting after the muse. You're not necessarily in love with the muse, but the muse is representative of the world, right? You can't go tell a great artist or a great writer or a great singer and say, okay, I want you to write a song that the world's going to love. That's too much pressure, right? But if you present them with a muse, they write for the muse, right? Because you can write for one person, and the muse is the world, if that makes sense to you. Beautiful. And I have a lot of friends that are, famous artists, famous writers, and they've had visions. Like I have a great artist friend of mine, a fantasy artist, does, like medieval type paintings, things like that. He says that this mysterious woman in black would always deliver him his finished painting. It was his muse. Wow. And it would come in a dream or a fantasy or a daydream. And she would always deliver what the painting would look like, and he would wind up painting it. But he actually put out an art book, a collection of all his art, and he writes about the woman in black that,
Mm.
that comes to him, and all her hooded cloak, and she's beautiful, and she presents this painting, and he thinks it's a muse. And a lot of people in the art world, photography, what have you, have had the same types of experiences. So I believe women give
Mm.
birth to all kinds of things, and I put
Yeah.
them on the highest level, and I love to have them as guests. So anyways,
Oh,
my
thank you.
commentary there at the end.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And yeah, that really, yeah, I really deeply am grateful for you sharing that and for lifting up. Yeah, the muse is such a sacred archetype. And you've pointed to something that I kind of want to round back to this notion of God, of like, what is this thing? And and maybe muse on that for a moment. But kind of circling back to where we started with the deep contemplation that existed inside of me as a young girl in the church, and then as a young girl who was like very embodied and empowered, and was a poet. And by the way, I named myself poet in 2018. It wasn't my husband's name, it wasn't my father's name, it's my name. And so there was this young girl who was questioning, like, what is the space of the feminine in this thing called church and this thing called God? And my life has really been a quest to reawaken that feminine in that place of the sacred, in that space of God. And so, on my quest to resurrect the feminine Christ next to the masculine Christ, like I say mother, father, God. And on my path, the relationship with the masculine that had to heal, it had to heal in me. I had to heal the relationship with men outside of myself. Um, Sometimes that means literal healing of relationships. Sometimes that just means forgiveness because the water's under the bridge, and that's all that can happen. And then I also have to heal my relationship with the masculine aspect of creation, because really I think that's where some of the greatest severance, the original severance, comes from in this myth of separation, that really the church perpetuates the myth of separation by saying God's a male and women aren't welcome
Yeah,
to be themselves. That's a
yeah,
separation message. And so the quest to say, like, yes, not only do I have a place here with the sacred, but sometimes my muse is the sacred masculine. Sometimes what enlivens me, what turns me on as like a human woman, is this idea of a unified God, and working with the masculine energetics in my own spiritual practice, in my own embodiment practice, like working with that question, like you're talking about a man holding this female muse, like in this it could be a spiritual aspect, it could be an actual woman, it could be a like an actress or something, like someone who inspires, a woman who inspires. Well, it's really exciting to be a woman and to almost sometimes have like a divine masculine like love, right? Like
yeah.
sometimes that's what it feels like in my explorations and in my practice. And it's actually really, really rich for a woman to just begin to ask herself, like, well, what does a healthy masculine feel like? And then how do I show up, with a healthy masculine? And that's so helpful, and it repairs so much in her, because like I don't have a relationship with my human father. There's too much there's too much, we haven't been able to do that yet. And but I can have a relationship with like the Holy Father, right?
Right.
And so that has healed. I can love my father without having a relationship with him. And like I said earlier, the kind of byproduct of that is forgiveness ultimately. Doesn't mean that I have to, well, especially with him, back in those days of being his child in the church, he would make grave mistakes and then say, God has forgiven me, now you do too.
Mm.
And so my father never learned to really apologize, and some things have been too great. And so I do ultimately forgive him, and I love him and understand the traumas that shaped him. And yet the love that is in my heart is like bigger than just him. It is bigger than any notion of one man or one God. It's like it's God itself. So thanks for listening to that little riff.
I love it. As
Yeah.
we start to wrap up here, I want to talk about your company. So your company, Embodied Breath, you offer a ton of stuff. I'm just going to touch on a couple things right now. You have one-on-one mentorships, you have soul alignment sessions, you have women's groups, couples coaching. So what can people expect from working with you? And are these programs any particular length or open certain times of the year? Tell me a little bit about that stuff.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm a very responsive person. So if someone's feeling a yes to wanting to reach out, I'll talk to anybody for 15 minutes. You can just schedule a call and we'll meet one another. And I love to do that. And so there's a free consultation on the website at sarahpoet.com for real. Like if you're feeling, oh my gosh, I want to talk to this lady, like just do it. Like I love that. Because I love to know who's out there listening. And then I do have private mentorship for women, but for anyone. Like I said, I needed to pick a lane in some aspects of the business. Most of my clients right now are women, and women leaders who are, these thought leaders who are creating new solutions, right? And that I work with a lot of women like that. In the new year, actually, those one-on-one 75-minute sessions, like those one-time sessions, are actually going away because my schedule's full. And so I can't do those 1 hour sessions anymore where we just talk about present moment, because what I really want to do is deep dive transformation. And so that's where that HR consulting work comes in, executive coaching, private mentorship. And then I do have groups listed on my website, and I offer those throughout the year, these women's groups that work in very specific areas. And so right now, it's going to probably have launched by the time this podcast comes out, but Structure and Flow is like a planner system. It's a 90-day planner system in feminine and masculine inner energy for women. It's amazing. I've used it for 2 years. It's so effective. And then my next group offering coming out in January, February is called Fall in Love with the King, but it is for women healing all aspects of their relationship to the masculine and working toward that love in the heart of the masculine. And then there will be others throughout the year. And yes, I do. If I have a space, I entertain, like if someone sees my, group business mentorship option and they want to do that in a private mentorship, if I have availability, I'll do that, or they can go on a waiting list for that.
And
yeah.
Is this stuff in person or Zoom?
Oh, so I've been online since 2018.
Okay. I was just
Like,
curious. Some
yeah,
people do some in person
pre-COVID.
still.
No. So one of the ways that this really works for me, because I'm a mom and a single mom. And so I am often like, I don't keep office hours in another office. Like I'm at home and I'm parenting and I'm
Sure,
like
yeah.
running the child to school and then doing 3 sessions and then picking the child up. And so I have not, since COVID, I don't think I've done any in person. If sometimes I live in a pretty awesome place. I live in Asheville, North Carolina. It's pretty progressive and cool. And so sometimes when I'm working with someone locally, especially couples, when I'm working with them locally, we'll do some in-person sessions because I can teach some things in person. But everything I do is totally effective online, because I can read energy. I'm reading facial expressions. I'm reading, I can read energy with my eyes closed, and so I don't worry about the effectiveness. It's very effective.
And you have a podcast. Where can people get that at?
Yeah, so everything's at sarahpoet.com. And so the podcast is on the website as well. But it's also streamed to Apple, Spotify, and Google Play. And that's the Sacred Remembering podcast. And the first 2 seasons were a lot of stories of like modern women waking up and reclaiming themselves. And then season 3 and 4 are a lot of my teachings, and then a lot of conversations about feminine and masculine dynamics, relational, different stories. So some just me and some interview. Thank you.
Where can people find you out there in the interwebs? You have a website. Are you on social media?
Yeah, sarahpoet.com, SARAHPOET. And that's the first place to find me and check out the offers and schedule that 15-minute call. And then I'm having the most fun on LinkedIn these days. And I still do post on Facebook, and a lot of clients do come from Facebook, but I don't do the Facebook group thing anymore. Like I actually have a membership as well for modern women waking up to the truth of who they are. And so I want to really work with people who are really changing their lives. And so in the new year, especially, like I'm inviting in the people who want to make really effective change, really own the truth of who they are, and then bring their gifts forward to really affect change on the planet and more connection and more unity on the planet. And so, I'm like inviting people in. So like come to sarahpoet.com and look at the membership and just like see if you want to dive in a little bit, and let's change this world.
Well, Sarah, I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and I love your perspective. I think you're brilliant.
Thank you so much.
I love what we got into today. I do appreciate it. I hope you come back.
Thank you, Todd. I would love to. Yes. Thank you so much for holding the space. And I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks for coming out. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
And there you have it. My interview with Sarah Poet. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time on Quest. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fischer and distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for the International Association of Metatomics at metatomics.org, or find us on social media for other unique content.